Okay, so welcome to our event, Ukraine Past, Present, Persistence, on behalf of the UBC Center for European Studies. The Center for European Studies and the University of British Columbia are located on the unceded, ancestral, and traditional lands of the Musqueam people. I am Dr. Catherine Bowers, Associate Professor of Slavic Studies in the Department of Central, Eastern, and Northern European Studies, and Director of the Center for European Studies at UBC, and I will be moderating today. I'd like to take a minute to thank our sponsors. This event is sponsored by the UBC Center for European Studies, the UBC Department of Central, Eastern, and Northern European Studies, the University of Victoria Department of Germanic and Slavic Studies, the Eurasia Research Cluster at UBC, the Public Humanities Hub at UBC-V, the Department of Anthropology at UBC, and the Department of Political Science at UBC. And this is one of a series of events that we have been having about Ukraine. So to get started, I would like to introduce Dr. Charlotte Chalier. Dr. Charlotte Chalier is the chair of the Department of Germanic and Slavic Studies at the University of Victoria, and she will introduce our speakers.
I would like to sincerely thank Katja Bowers and the UBC Center for European Studies for inviting us and for hosting this event. We are also very grateful to all the sponsors at UBC. Before I introduce my two esteemed colleagues, I would like to acknowledge and respect with humility and gratitude the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. It is a great privilege and honor that I'm introducing our two speakers. Dr. Tamara Krawchenko is a member of UVic's Institute for Integrated Energy Systems with expertise in comparative public policy and territorial development. Tamara's scholarship examines the unique needs of places and how public policies and institutions of governance shape lived realities and outcomes. Dr. Serhy Yekelchyk has published 7 books on Ukrainian history, including 2 on the present conflict with Russia. Born and educated in Ukraine, Serhy is a leading media commentator on this topic. At UVic, he teaches a variety of courses in the Department of Germanic and Slavic Studies and the Department of History, including a course on modern Ukraine and the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte. I would like to take a moment now as we begin, a moment of silence for us to reflect on the situation in Ukraine and on the terrible suffering of the Ukrainian people. So today's discussion is going to be a moderated discussion between me and Dr. Yekelchyk and Dr. Krawchenko. And the way that we're going to do this is I will ask questions to start with, and they will answer. So we will have this discussion. We have a vision that it will be an interactive discussion. And we ask that if you do have questions for the speakers, you wait until after this discussion has happened, and then we will begin taking questions from the audience and hopefully blend from our discussion directly into audience discussion. If you do have a question, please place it in the Q&A box. We will be moderating questions from the Q&A. The Q&A box is located at the bottom of your screen. It says Q&A, it has the little speech bubbles on it, and you can ask questions there. So to get started, the first question seems like a very basic bare bones question, but my question is, what is Ukraine as a nation?
Hi, I think I was going to take that question first. So I'll start by just giving you what Ukraine has told us. Its values are as a nation. They just put this out. They said that this is our short list of values and what we stand for. Ukraine stands for freedom, dignity, respect, human rights, rule of law, solidarity, self-organization, social responsibility, equality, freedom of speech, peaceful protest, transparency, accountability, religious freedom, multiculturalism, and international law. And that's just the short list. There are others.
And I would add to this that Ukraine is a nation and a state which was formed as a result of a Ukrainian national movement fighting for the homeland for Ukrainians. But modern Ukraine, as it developed in the decades since Ukrainian independence, is actually a multi-ethnic democratic state which welcomes people of all ethnic identities and all political views and religious beliefs. It's only the allegiance to Ukraine as a state which now determines whether or not you are a member of this political nation.
So what does it mean to you both to be Ukrainian? And what does it mean generally to be Ukrainian, do you think?
There are two meanings now to being Ukrainian. Many of you would be familiar, no doubt, with the notion of wearing embroidered shirts, singing and dancing, perhaps eating pierogies and making excellent pierogies. But this is the ethnic concept of Ukrainian identity. This is what distinguishes you as belonging to the Ukrainian ethnic group, regardless of which country you live in. But now, after the collapse of communism, and especially after the two recent democratic revolutions in Ukraine, a different concept of Ukrainian identity is predominant. This is the concept which is defined as being European, quote unquote, in a sense of the rule of law, democracy, equal opportunity for all, fighting against corruption, and not being like a totalitarian dictatorship, like the Soviet Union was, and very much like Russia is today. So the opposition to authoritarian projects which seek to control the population, to organize crackdowns on any political movements and media, that already defines you as being Ukrainian, democratic, open, thinking of yourself as belonging into the world in which human rights are enormously important.
I can answer that. I'm Ukrainian Canadian, so I bridge both worlds, and I spent time growing up both in Ukraine and in Canada. And for me, to be Ukrainian has always been to feel the weight of history and to fight this long fight against tyranny and oppression. And I feel like every generation of my family going back on the Ukrainian side has had to fight this authoritarianism, this chauvinism, and this oppression. And it's shaped who Ukrainians are as a people. And who are Ukrainians as a people? I think that we see Ukrainians today as this, again, like Serhy said, this diverse society that is so inclusive of different groups, that has respect for diverse peoples, and for whom there is a poetry in the way they speak. I think a creativity, a real sense of individualism, and yet a colossal responsibility to the collective, and a healthy disdain, I think, for authority, and only respect when respect is earned. And people have described this, sociologists like Mikhailo Winnicki have described this as a heterarchic society, as opposed to a very hierarchical society as you see in Russia today. And I think that that is partly what it is to be Ukrainian.
Thank you. I'd like to follow up on that a little bit, and I'd like you each to speak a little bit about your research and also your activism. Does your activism inform your research, or vice versa? And how does being Ukrainian bear on your work individually?
Perhaps I have to start with an important point. that for many of us in the generation which came of age when the Soviet Union was collapsing and when an independent Ukraine emerged, being Ukrainian was a choice we made willingly, a choice we made in opposition to the empire and authoritarian rule. So great many scholars and activists I know in Ukraine went to schools with the Russian language of instruction. They redefined themselves, or they rediscovered their Ukrainian identity at the moment when the Soviet Union was collapsing, when the popular movement of Ukraine for perestroika, now known as Ruch by its Ukrainian name, played a major role in mobilizing the Ukrainian political nation. That political nation included all kinds of other ethnic and religious groups, very notably ethnic Russians and Jews, but it basically equated the two things, the notion of democracy and the notion of your belonging to the Ukrainian civic nation, the Ukrainian political body. So that was a decision we made. It was not something people were born with in my generation, if only because there were so few Ukrainian schools in large Ukrainian cities when we were growing up, which in my case would be the 70s and early 80s. So the transition to independent Ukraine, for me, coincided exactly with the years of being a graduate student. And that was a discovery in many senses of both Ukraine as an identity and myself within this project. We also underwent the scare of the right-wing coup, or perhaps left-wing coup, in the Soviet Union when the communist apparatchiks tried to remove Mikhail Gorbachev and bring things back to the Soviet Empire. And that was the moment when quite a few of my colleagues got together and started talking about, am I going to rewrite the entire introduction to my thesis? And also chapter 3 and 5? No. And that is a kind of funny reason to reject the Soviet project, but it ultimately underscores the importance of how the expression of what we do creates the political space in which we function. So accepting the empire back was not an option. What we were facing back in the 1990s was, of course, very chaotic, somewhat corrupt, and yet undeniably democratic Ukrainian state, in which presidents changed quite often, prime ministers even more often. But ultimately, there was always the recognition that sovereignty is invested in the people. It is actually the multinational, the multi-ethnic people of Ukraine who are the source of sovereignty, not the state itself, and not the state deriving its importance from a single dictator who thinks he is adored by the people, as is the case in some neighboring countries. Now, then, in my case, the second period of studying in Canada and then eventually landing a job here in Victoria in 2001 put me on the road towards something else. I was hired as a historian of the Soviet Union with an obligation to teach 2 courses on Russian culture. As the world, however, was reshaping itself, and as the importance of Ukraine was becoming obvious to the American government, to academics and the public, and then the popular revolution took place in Ukraine in 2004. That also coincided very neatly with my drive to introduce courses on Ukrainian history, and eventually later on the Ukrainian language. And renaming our department with the support, unanimous support of all our colleagues, from Germanic and Russian studies to Germanic and Slavic studies, to indicate that it's not just Russia that we are going to study. So it was an evolution of the world and the evolution of us as academics in this world. And I'm sure Tamara has plenty of interesting stories to tell you as well, in a slightly different context, because for me, Ukraine always has been and remains home. And now it's a funny feeling of having 2 homes, here in Canada and there in Ukraine, and one of them being threatened with an overwhelming force of the past coming from the past, from my past as well, which I remember all too well.
And Serhy, we should mention all the excellent books that you've written about Ukraine, including Ukraine and Modern History and all you need to know about Ukraine, right? For all of our listeners. Serhy is such an expert, and I'm reading his history on Ukraine right now, which is excellent. My own relationship with Ukraine and how it relates to my academic work is, I can say, in a sense, the reason why I study public administration today is because of my experiences growing up and how I was shaped by what I saw in Ukraine, how important good governance is, what a colossal difference it makes to societies that flourish or those that are corrupt and decay. And it is for that reason that I study what I do. Now, I don't just study Ukraine, I study lots of different countries. I grew up in Edmonton, in the Hromada in Edmonton, which is a Ukrainian Canadian community where actually Chrystia Freeland grew up there as well. And this was a group of, intellectuals and artists who were all fighting for Ukraine's independence. And I remember the day when Ukraine was granted independence. We had such a party. My father was the head of the Institute for Canadian Institute for Ukrainian Studies. And like many academics, Ukrainian Canadian academics, when the Soviet Union collapsed, he went back to Ukraine to support the country and was the vice rector of the Academy for Public Administration there. So my links to Ukraine are personal. They are a family project. My brother helped draft the Ukrainian's constitution. My sister runs a publishing house that promotes Ukrainian cultural and identity abroad. This is a family project, a connection and a desire to support Ukraine to flourish.
Thank you. I have a couple of linked questions that follow up on some of your answers. The first one of these is, so these are questions about myth and history. The first question is, what are some myths about Ukraine that you've heard that you'd like to dispel?
Yeah, I have like, I was looking at the question. Why not just print a list? First of all, I'd like to describe Ukraine. What is Ukraine? Ukraine is, a beautiful, diverse country with amazing culture and heritage, and has, of course, some of the most amazing soil in Europe, like equivalent to a third of the arable land of all of Europe is in Ukraine alone. It is much more equal than Russian society. So the Gini coefficient is around 26.6 as opposed to 40% in Russia. And I just want to describe Ukraine like that it's such a modern nation, that there were so many amazing democratic, anti-corruption and decentralization reforms happening. And that's important to just have a picture of what is this society. This is a place where in Kyiv, thousands of people turned out for the gay pride parade. Whereas in Moscow, that has been banned completely and for 100 years in the future. So speaking about Ukraine, what is Ukraine as a place? I'm just trying to give you a flavor. It's super dynamic, cultural, and diverse. There's a lot of course, we're fighting a whole bunch of disinformation that's been coming from the Kremlin and beamed into our televisions, even here in Canada, through groups like Russia Today. So these are some of the myths about Ukraine. The first is that Russian-speaking residents in the Donbas region have been subjected to genocide. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe has found no evidence of this. It's just not true. There is a myth that Russia did not target civilian infrastructure in Ukraine at the start of the invasion. Well, they did, and Amnesty International has documented this. There is a myth that for some reason that Nazism is rampant in Ukrainian politics and society and that it's supported by authorities in Kyiv. Just to make clear, the candidate for the far-right Nationalist Party, Svoboda, won 1.6% of the vote in the 2019 presidential election. Equivalent parties in places like Italy have received 12%. There's a lot of talk about the Azov Battalion. Now, this is a super weird fringe group. They say they're not Nazis, but they sometimes use insignia. They have been useful fighting because they are so militant. They are dangerous to Ukrainian society, I think, which everyone acknowledges. And they are a threat to democracy because they, in fact, don't support the government and want to overthrow it. So there's also that. And I find that the left often focuses on this and has a strange fixation, meanwhile not noticing that Russia has turned into an ethno-nationalist fascist state that has built an entire identity around, sort of racist politics. So, and I could go on. There's lots of different myths, and I think we're going to be talking about disinformation. But a final one that I'll remark on is that modern Ukraine was entirely created by communist Russia, and that's simply not true. And Serhy can tell you all about that. But in fact, Ukrainian heritage goes back over 1,000 years.
I would add just a few points. One of them would, of course, be that Ukrainians are allegedly intrinsically anti-Semitic, but that has been dispelled in a way already by the fact that the Ukrainian president is of a Jewish background, which everybody knew, and he won the victory by landslide by 73%. So clearly for Ukrainians, it is the political program and the promise perhaps of a new phase in politics that are way more important than the actual background of this person. So Ukraine is definitely not a neo-Nazi state Russia wants to portray it as, whereas in fact Russia itself largely projects an identity based on its past as one of the states contributing to the victory in World War II. But in reality, the Russian politics of today is defined very clearly as the extreme religious right. So they claim to be the most consistently conservative religious Christian regime on earth, even more so than Trump, way more so than Trump. And this is somehow is very often, as Tamara said, lost on left-wing Western intellectuals who somehow assume that if Russia is anti-American, it must be a wonderful socialist project. It is, in fact, much more conservative than the United States themselves. And of course, the other myth, which is making rounds in the media these days, again, originating in the Russian propaganda, is that the war itself is the responsibility of the NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, because this organization allegedly wants to constantly expand, surround poor Russia with military bases, which would make it impossible for Russia to defend itself. Nothing can be further from truth because Ukraine never received an offer to join the NATO. The Ukrainian population until recently didn't even provide majority support for in polling about potentially joining NATO. It only changed with the beginning of the Russian involvement in Ukraine. The Russian aggression started with the occupation sponsorship of the war in the Donbas region. Once that started, then the majority of the population started expressing support for the idea of joining NATO. So it is in fact not the Western conspiracy, but Russia is itself responsible because it makes war on its neighbors and tries to overthrow political systems in nearby states. That is what makes people want to join NATO. However, the only time the issue of Ukrainian admission to NATO was seriously discussed in 2008, it was decisively voted down by two powerful European players, France and Germany, and it was not raised until now. And the reason why it was raised now is precisely because Mr. Putin invaded Ukraine. So here you see how the widespread notions from Russian propaganda inform assumptions in the West in some circles, whereas the opposite is in fact true.
Thank you. And I just wanted to reiterate that it's really striking how many of those myths are contemporary myths, and they are contemporary myths that are seriously spread by Russian disinformation, misinformation, that they originate there. So we will be talking a lot more about disinformation, misinformation today, but I feel like we should go backwards a little bit. And I know that we've mentioned a number of historical events. So for example, the two democratic uprisings in Ukraine, the seizure of Crimea, a number of other events. And I'm wondering if you could just reflect on which key events you think have most shaped Ukrainian history.
Ukraine has developed from a mighty medieval empire, which is known now as Kievan Rus, with a center in the city of Kiev, which is the capital of Ukraine. Russia also traces its historical lineage from this very same empire. Even so, in those days, Moscow emerged very late, and it was located at the far edge of the empire in the forest where there wasn't much activity at all. What this competition actually means is that the two types of history are competing there. The history written in traditional way as the history of great people, mostly great men and the state, and the history of the people. So if you trace the ruling dynasty, then yes, indeed, Russia has a continuity in ruling dynasty. But what does it mean for a present-day reader or historian if we are trying to trace different things, the everyday life, the dialects, and the people who lived there in medieval period are still actually on the ground, and they are Ukrainians today. So Ukraine and Russia do originate from the same source, but Ukraine, unfortunately for Mr. Putin, has a much better claim to incorporating Kievan Rus into its history. This is, of course, one of the factors which fuels the invasion. How can you possibly tolerate that your imperial capital, a place where your legendary knights are buried and where all kinds of folk poetry is based, it is actually abroad? It must be part of the empire. That's one of the reasons why Mr. Putin wants to recover Ukraine for the Russian nation. Now, the other crucial moments in Ukrainian history included the emergence of the Cossack state. First, within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, where Cossack officers acquired European concepts of what it means to be a citizen, as opposed to being subject. So when the Ukrainian Cossack state accepted the protection of the Muscovite Tsar in the mid-17th century, the officers fully expected the envoys of the Tsar to take an oath on his behalf as well, which of course the envoys refused because the Tsar was a despotic ruler who could not be held responsible to his rulers, to his subjects. And so the Ukrainian polity, with its concepts of social contract coming from Europe, became incorporated into the empire where the despotic political regime was in fact in place. And eventually, the Russian Empire absorbed the Ukrainian lands, incorporating them one by one, including already by the mid-20th century as the outcome of World War II. And yet we should not, of course, believe that it was Lenin who created Ukraine, the line much reiterated by Mr. Putin and his speechwriters. Lenin, when he allowed the creation of the Ukrainian Soviet Republic as part of the Soviet Union, he knew perfectly well why he was doing that, because during the revolution, a different Ukrainian republic emerged in Ukraine, a non-Bolshevik one. And the Bolsheviks established their authority in 1917 and 1918. And then again in 1919, they had to conquer Ukraine several times. And then again in 1920, literally every year they were rebuffed and then coming back, pretending that they were actually Ukrainians, whereas great many of them came straight from Moscow. So because there was a precedent of Ukrainian statehood in 1918 and 1919, the precedent of uniting the two Ukrainian republics, one created in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the other in the former Russian Empire, the idea of sovereign Ukraine was already established. So Lenin and Stalin were responding to the challenge, trying to satisfy the demands of the Ukrainian people in order to incorporate them into a Soviet state. So it is completely incorrect to think that the Bolsheviks had created Ukraine during a long period from 1917 to 1945.
Just to chime in on that, I don't know how anyone could look at Ukrainians today and see their solidarity and their identity and think that they are anything but a nation of peoples. Look at what they're achieving. Look at how they fight for their sovereignty and right to exist. I would just add to the great history that Serhy just provided, that there have been, of course, several revolutions in Ukraine that have been people's revolutions. The Revolution on Granite, the Orange Revolution, and then most recently, the Revolution of Dignity. And if anyone wants to really understand Ukraine, they should certainly watch the Netflix documentary Winter on Fire, which Netflix has now put on YouTube, so everyone can watch it for free. And it'll explain how people rose up essentially against a Kremlin-controlled president and just had enough with corruption and everyday violence and demanded that there be good governance and to live in a normal country where there's rule of law, and to fight in solidarity with those who were being harmed by government oppression. And so I would encourage everyone to watch that documentary. And that's such a pivotal moment in Ukraine. And my sister was there, by the way, and I didn't mention this, but she lives in Kyiv and she had to flee. And this week she became a war refugee. She's now in Germany with her family and their 3 children.
Thank you. So that's really powerful. And that all leads into what I think is a really tough question, or maybe a very, maybe a question with a relatively simple, obvious answer. But I'm really interested to hear what you both think. And this is the last question on our poster, which is, why does the Russian Federation seek to destroy both Ukrainian sovereignty and identity today? As you both mentioned, this is such a strong identity. Ukraine is definitely not a country that was created by Lenin, right? This is not an imaginary country. It's a real place. These are real people. So why does the Russian Federation seek to destroy both Ukrainian sovereignty and identity today?
There are a few reasons. One is that Mr. Putin's agenda is to restore the influence of the Russian Empire, the sphere of influence. And he actually goes beyond restoring the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union accepted that Ukrainians were a separate nation. And that's why there was the Ukrainian Republic within the Soviet Union. Mr. Putin actually denies that. He claims that Ukrainians are part of the Russian nation. They only speak a dialect. And that is the Tsarist concept, which goes back to the Russian Empire before 1917. And that was, of course, an oppressive empire which banned publication of books and magazines and newspapers and anything, even music, in the Ukrainian language. And that's the kind of an example he is inspired by. But also, it is a wider struggle against the West more generally and against his own people. And this point is really often not well understood, especially in the West. Mr. Putin worries about his domestic audience seeing Ukraine as a powerful example of what democracy is. As we are seeing last weekend, the number of Russian protesters arrested keeps going up, keeps creeping up. So the protests are spreading, notwithstanding the enormously draconian measures. And this is the real reason why Mr. Putin wants Ukraine gone. Because the 2 Ukrainian revolutions provided an example to the Russians how you can change your government. In 2011 and 2012, mass protests erupted in Moscow and St. Petersburg and other major Russian cities against the elections that were to confirm the continued rule by Mr. Putin and his puppet, Mr. Medvedev. When they saw this eruption of protest, the leadership of the Russian Federation became scared. They actually realized that people were trying to do the same as in Ukraine. And so that's why the reaction was also so violent. It's not just about the empire, not just about the past. It's also about not allowing Russia a democratic example. And also, if you read the Russian press, which I would advise against, but I have to do it for my work, it creates a very distorted picture of the world. For instance, the Russian media insists that only the radical nationalists are resisting in Ukraine, because others would, of course, gratefully accept the Russian army and Mr. Putin's rule. And this argument is stretching all kinds of limits of credibility, especially when we talk about the siege of the city of Kharkiv, the closest to the Russian border, big city where the overwhelming majority of the population is Russian speaking, many of them ethnic Russians. So the Russian Federation expected to receive their hero's welcome with flowers and everything, and yet Kharkov and its residents fought back because they are political Ukrainians. They don't want to become political Russians. So quite a few reasons why, but also I think Ukraine is presented in the Russian press as part of the West. The Russian readers were told that the war or the operation, the special operation, was necessary because the West was about to attack anyway. The attack from the West was imminent, and it was to be conducted via Ukraine. That's the message the Russian people heard from their own press. So essentially, Mr. Putin realizes, of course, that he cannot really truly attack the West because he is outgunned immediately and his regime would be destroyed. So his plan in this particular aspect is to present any victories in Ukraine as generic victories over the West in general. Even so, Ukraine is fighting alone, but with significant support now from its Western friends and allies. But that calculation also didn't work because there was no easy victory over the West, real or imaginary. So Mr. Putin is locked in his dilemma because there is too much at stake for him, really, in this game. And Ukraine, it follows from here, is fighting also for democratic Russia, and it follows from here, it's fighting for the ideas of the West more generally.
I don't know what I can add to that other than Putin described these deeply, deeply chauvinist attitudes in his essay on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. And what that essay does is it denies that Ukrainians have a right to exist. It denies their very identity and calls them little Russians, subservient Russians. Let's be very, very clear. Subservient to great Russian greatness. There is a deeply, deeply authoritarian ethno-nationalist element driving politics. It was highly courted in the mid-2000s, officially by government groups, including the creation of youth groups like Nashe. There was a large number of neo-Nazi skinheads. They conducted very, very violent acts, including in Moscow and St. Petersburg, leading at one point a group of 11 of them stabbed a 9-year-old Tajik girl to death, and this started to get in the news. And then there was a bit of a clampdown on these groups by the Kremlin. They have then loosened them up again. And I think that since the Maidan Revolution, you see the courting of this ethno-nationalism very, very strongly. And I'd like to point out how contradictory that is, because just looking at the makeup of the Russian Federation, yes, it is around 81% Russian, but there's also a large number of other groups, including the Tatar. Ukrainian is about 1.4%, others, but also a huge amount of labor migration from Central Asia. And that Russia is this large, diverse federation, and they're constructing a mythology that is incoherent, in fact, to who they are as a nation, as a federation. And also, adding on to this is colossal regional inequality. So the income gap between Moscow and Dagestan in the 1990s, it was around 27% income gap. Today, it's around 400%, this colossal inequality. So think of trying to govern that. Think of the myths that they're creating about greatness and the level of authoritarianism because of the vast amount of inequality, the vast amount of theft from the Kremlin that is trying to solidify these political power. And I see that as a big part of what the Kremlin is trying to achieve. There's a great book. I just want to mention one book. It's called The New Russian Nationalism, Imperialism, Ethnicity, and Authoritarianism. Unfortunately, it ends at 2015 because I think that there's been a huge ramp up since then, but it's available online for anyone who wants to read that for free. I can put it in the comments.
Yes, if you could, that would be great. And I think also trying to just to add on to that, this is one reason why this Soviet mythology that Russia is putting forward is kind of important for them, for the Russian government, because the Soviet mythology is that there is this kind of this brotherhood of nations that work together for this one cause. In this case, the one cause is kind of Russian sovereignty, but that mythology can be powerful, especially when it is put forward by a strong propaganda machine. So this war, as we know, has been ongoing for 8 years, although the Russian army only invaded a couple of weeks ago, or 10 days ago, rather. Could you talk a little about the Maidan and why that event from February 2014 is still so important in this war?
Serhy, I'll let you take that.
Yeah, we've already touched on this a little bit, but it would be good to discuss further.
That was the moment when Russia felt that it needed to send a strong signal to its own domestic audience about such revolutions not being allowed. It also felt that it was a good opportunity for them to invade, to grab at least some Ukrainian territory, first of all, the Crimea. And Maidan demonstrated for the second time in the last 20 years the ability of the Ukrainian people to stand together, to mobilize politically in defense of freedom. And of course, this happening in the middle of a very cold winter, exactly the same as the previous revolution, the Orange Revolution in 2004-2005, also demonstrated the enormous commitment of the people of Ukraine to fighting for their rights. And that was a signal which Mr. Putin really wanted to suppress. He thought Russia would take advantage of the transition period in Ukraine, would claim that the Ukrainian government was not legitimate. Even so, it was immediately approved by the majority of the parliament, and the snap presidential elections produced an unambiguous result in Ukraine. But it was also at the same time the moment for Mr. Putin to raise his popularity, and this is what is happening now as well, except he miscalculated this time too. Because back then in 2014, Russia grabbed the Crimean Peninsula, which had the majority Russian population. Crimea has a very long, complex, and tragic history. It became a majority Russian region only in recent memory as a result of Stalin's genocidal deportation. Prior to that, it was a society in which the Crimean Tatars, the native people of the region, Ukrainians, and Russians all had significant. None of these groups had the majority of the population. So that capturing Crimea, occupying Crimea, produced marvelous results for Mr. Putin's domestic audience. And he thought that perhaps invading Ukraine again now would repeat the same trick, but this did not quite happen because there was a prehistory of mobilizing the Russian population to fight for the Crimea, which is not in fact present in the current conflict. So there are all kinds of things, dreams of restoring the empire, the population nostalgic for the good old days of power and being a great power, Mr. Putin's concerns about his popularity and whether the political system he had built would survive, transitions still necessary from time to time, no matter how many times you change the Russian constitution. Every now and then you have to have something called elections, also they're understood very differently in Russia. And so that was the precise explanation of why Mr. Putin wanted to demonstrate to the world, to Ukraine, and very importantly, to his own audience, that something like the Ukrainian Revolution would not be allowed in Russia. So in 2014, he responded to this popular rebellion by initiating the pro-Russian insurgency, which in fact was a special operation of the Russian Secret Service to start with. It was never really a spontaneous rebellion. And then using the Russian army while denying this fact to perpetuate the war in the Donbass, the region on the border of Russia and Ukraine, and also to occupy the Crimea. Well, that's why Maidan, the Maidan Revolution in 2014, named based on the name of the main square in Kiev, the Euromaidan, because of the European slogans, because it was fought under the slogan of orienting ourselves politically and economically towards Europe, representing a more democratic and open model as opposed to the Russian autocratic and closed model. That revolution was a challenge to Mr. Putin, just in the same way as Ukraine is a challenge to his imperial dreams.
I just add 2 points to what Serhy said. One is this idea of Russian greatness. I just want to just put some numbers to this. So Canada and Ukraine, Canada and Russia have around the same GDP, but Russia has 2/3 more of the population. So I just want to put that out there as in terms of this, what kind of economies are we talking about? Does Canada ever describe itself as a nation in these terms? We'll know, but there you have it. And the other point I want to make about 2014 and Crimea and what has happened there is that it's been an absolute tragedy for the indigenous population of Crimean Tatars. Russia has replaced 1/3 of the population with loyal Russians in Crimea. This is population replacement. And you can see that this idea of, creating this new historical unity between Russians and Ukrainians in Ukraine is about replacing, bad Ukrainians with good Russians, I think. You can say, creating this identity. And in Crimea, thousands of Tatars have lost their homeland, have had to leave because of the brutal repression they have faced. And their very governmental body was banned in 2016, the Mejlis, which has been called by Russia as an extremist organization. And you recognize these terms. It's exactly what they're saying in Ukraine. They've done the same thing to the Crimean Tatar.
You. Yes, this repression of the Crimean Tatars also comes on. I mean, this is a people who have been repressed for a very long time, right? They were deported from Crimea already under Stalin, and then those that came back are facing this. It's tragic. The internet and the Ukrainian government's communication strategy has played and this is getting more into information, disinformation. The internet and the Ukrainian government's communication strategy has played a major role in getting global public attention and sympathy. And I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Well, it's the Ukrainian government, to start with. It's a very recent government resulting from the popular revolution, which was followed by an electoral revolution, which at first many people felt basically replaced the regime of those who in Ukraine came to power as on a wave of social protest and protest against Russia. But in reality, it turns out very soon that for all the political differences between President Poroshenko and President Zelensky, they shared something very important, a commitment to being part of Europe, the democratic West, the rule of law, and equal opportunity for all are equally important to these two very different political parties. So we are talking here possibly about Mr. Putin expecting to face a weaker president, a president who promised some negotiations with Russia to resolve this war, which has been going on, simmering for 8 years, also as a low intensity conflict, but still people losing their lives every week, essentially for these 8 years, and an enormous displacement of population, which was perhaps the greatest unrecognized or undiscussed problem in European history, because very few people would actually know that Ukraine already incorporated 1.5 million of internally displaced people since 2014. So the crisis that is now seen on the Ukrainian border with its Western allies, it has the prehistory. So lots of people already lost their homes during this war. Now, the strategy pursued by the Ukrainian government, because so many people in this government came from all kinds of entertainment industry, and there were actually new people selected by the new political party, which was in fact created just before the elections. Many of them came from the background very familiar with information technologies and the use of the internet. And I assume with the encouragement of Ukraine's allies in the West, they pursued a proactive strategy, something we have never seen before. And I do believe that military historians will have to note that as the first case really in world history in which the invasion was being prepared and the Ukrainian government kept telling the world what was happening, that the invasion was coming. And then this information was taken up by Western media platforms and the governments who also said, well, we know exactly what you're planning to do. Here is the list. And we have just seen you move the troops. And we know you're preparing a false flag operation. And we know your invasion is going to unfold like that. And we know your plan to blockade the cities, to starve the population, to start shelling the cities. We know that. We have the information about that. And also your preparations demonstrate that this is what you are going to do. And so this proactive strategy of the country about to be attacked and the proactive strategy of the world media, I suspect, sidelined the Russian plans more than once. Most likely the date of the invasion and some particular measures, and even the false flag operation, which we know was being prepared, was not in fact made public because of this proactive strategy of Ukraine and the democratic world press. This is unprecedented. But perhaps is also unprecedented in the 21st century is the wall of silence which Russia uses to protect its own population from truth about this war. You know, of course, about the draconian measures taken by the Russian government, the elimination of all the remaining, like two stations and one newspaper that did not fully agree with the government, by now eliminated, and the only newspaper is left on the condition that it never uses the term war. And all the materials about the war, which by the way included an interview with me, were removed at the last moment before being posted. So Russia then pursues the very opposite, but also very dangerous and telling strategy. It's trying to completely shelter its own population from the truth. It took enormously unusual step for the country which projects itself as a great empire of not bringing back the bodies of the fallen soldiers. The relatives, even those who receive notices about their loved one being killed in Ukraine, are told to wait for the bodies until the end of the operation, that is the war. The Russian units carry mobile crematoria with them. Apparently, they are burying the bodies close to the place of the context of the conflict itself, close to where they were killed, just crossing the border into Russia or into Belarus, which is an allied state of Russia. So these measures are unprecedented. The empire knows it is wrong. The empire knows it is committing war crimes. But interestingly, the struggle now is to keep its population uninformed and therefore obedient. And I think the stage at which we are right now is when the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian activists are trying to reach out to the Russians by whatever channels are left. And you perhaps have read articles about the only really channel which is left for us, and that is writing comments about Russian businesses and restaurants. And so lots of activists around the world go there because these
I've been doing that.
Yeah, good for you. Yeah, it's very difficult to remove them. So instead of leaving the opinion about the quality of food or accommodations, they post pictures of the war and appeals to the Russian public. So it is a very much information war. It is the war in which Ukraine successfully has been using its open strategy because it has nothing to hide, whereas Russia was conscientiously closing all doors and trying to protect its own population from finding out the truth about the war.
Just to chime in on that, I will say that anyone who's been paying attention to media narratives in Russia I felt like a frog in a pot of boiling water. They are using dehumanizing language, genocidal language, the way that they're framing things, the amount of disinformation, the amount of utter hate coming out, anti-Ukrainian hate, and the amplification of white supremacy abroad has been horrifying to watch and just wanting to scream to the world, pay attention to what's playing out. Don't, follow the money. And now finally it's come to a head, and we can see what this was all about. And I'm very glad that that we are getting, or so-called news channels that are just Kremlin propaganda off of the airwaves in Western and European countries. And this is a, Ukrainian government and Ukrainians in general, there's a large millennial generation. We have people on TikTok, news is getting out, and we are seeing the horrors of this genocide play out in real time because of the connectivity. And I think that's one of the reasons why they are going after all of the telecommunications commitment. They want to shut it down. I'm so glad that Ukrainian narratives are getting out, that Ukrainian stories are being shared. And I just want to say how grateful I am, and I think everyone, all Ukrainians are, for the solidarity that's being shown. It is so totally uplifting to feel acknowledged and seen because of the horrible propaganda and lies and everything that Ukrainians have been battling for so long. So this solidarity is amazing, and I just we need to keep it up and keep amplifying Ukrainian voices so that the world knows and sees and understands what's happening there.
So I had a question about the war on information and disinformation and misinformation, which I believe we've already answered. And my main point was that I read an article last week, which called the era that we're living in the war on information. And it dated this war on information from the early 2010s, and just pointed out conflict after conflict that has been shaped by disinformation, including things like elections in other countries, right? And I had wondered, my original question was, how would you say that disinformation or misinformation has shaped the war in Ukraine? But I think I would like to amend that and just ask if you have anything you'd like to add on to what you've already said in that direction. And if not, that's fine too.
Maybe very quickly. I think those of us following the Russian media have seen that the change started around 2007, 2008, which was marked by President Putin's speech at the Munich Security Conference, in which he directly positioned Russia as the opposite of the West. But also the kind of the representation the West was receiving in the Russian media looked eerily similar to what the German press was writing before World War I. And it was the militarism of the variety which I found unbelievable in the world emerging from World War II. When the front page news, for instance, of the most popular newspaper in Russia would be, we have tested a new missile, and all the American generals fell from their chairs because our missile is so great. And this has been going on for many years. And in recent years, this propaganda of militarism, which should have been very recognizable for all former Soviet citizens for what it was, for the people who lived through World War II, like many people are still alive, by the way, who survived the Nazi occupation in the city of Kiev, and they are now basically being blockaded by Russia. That's quite an experience for them, right? So this militarism, the drumming up of the historical wrongs inflicted by the West on Russia has been going on for more than a decade, for I think nearly 2 decades now. And we should realize there's the entire generation which grew up consuming these narratives. So when in the last year, the Russian press really switched to saying, well, the war is the only solution. Like the war is not good, but if we don't solve this issue, then we will be attacked, of course, by the West. The attack of the West is imminent. NATO is going to attack anytime now. Be ready, right? So it produced a reaction in the Russian society, which we need to thoroughly understand. It would take some time, to do a detox, really. Because in World War I and in World War II, there was a powerful detox for the people who consumed radical exclusivist propaganda. but we are actually dealing with the entire generation of people, perhaps two generations, who grew up missing the great empire, missing the status when people were afraid of you. And I guess that's really what shocks me most. That the greatness is measured in being a nuclear power which behaves in such a strange way that people are afraid of you, and that's what they like. So I do believe in the emergence one day of a democratic Russia, but I do think we are unfortunately, because of Mr. Putin's policies, we are unfortunately back in the Cold War period. We have been through that. Some of us remember the Cold War. And it actually required a very active counter-propaganda measures, right? So fact-checking, fighting back against falsifications. And you have to be vigilant for that. You have to double-check, to triangulate the information. And this is what the major Western media platforms are now doing. I think we have lost by now the sense which was very much present during the Cold War, that, okay, they're broadcasting their propaganda on us, we are broadcasting our information on them. This has been lost, right? So the people, and sometimes even media organizations say, oh, but the opposite point of view is presented by such and such official of the Russian government. But of course, this official is lying. But somehow, over the years, since the Cold War, they grew accustomed to the fact that everybody is playing by democratic rules, that people, have dignity, that journalists don't lie openly, that politicians are not supposed to be rude, and countries are not supposed to attack each other. All these certainties have been challenged by the Russian propaganda before being challenged by the Russian military machine. So we are back into the Cold War mode. We don't like it at all, but unfortunately, we have to acknowledge that.
I think sometimes about this fellow I saw in the airport in Istanbul, a Russian tourist wearing a shirt that said, "You don't have to like us, you have to fear us." So this is the chauvinism. They're proud of it. It's a t-shirt, it's a slogan on a t-shirt. Russia is for Russians. That's another slogan that's on t-shirts. And this is a mentality. And just to chime into what Serhy was saying, we're having a lot of stories come out of people, daughters, sons who are in Ukraine, in cities that are being bombed and bombarded and destroyed, calling their parents in Russia, and their parents don't believe them. They would rather believe Kremlin propaganda than their own flesh and blood. And many are having to disown their parents because of this vast cognitive dissonance. I do not understand this mentality. I cannot wrap my hand around it. It is horrendous. And how do we need real strategies to combat this?
Yeah, definitely. And those kinds of stories, I mean, all of the stories coming out of Ukraine are heartbreaking, right? But those kind of stories are especially heartbreaking when you feel the pain of the Ukrainians that are under fire and being bombed and fleeing, and their relatives don't believe them. So at this point, we're going to start taking questions from the audience. There are a number of questions already queued, which I will start asking. If you do have a question that you would like to have asked, we will try to get to as many as we can in the next about 25 minutes. You can write them in the Q&A. The Q&A box is located at the bottom of the Zoom window. And we will not be taking questions from the chat. We will be taking questions from the Q&A box. We can only really keep tabs on one of them at once. So please do write your question in the Q&A box. So the first question is from Shane Barturf, and he asks, I observed elections in 2019 in Severodonetsk. Many people I spoke to were clearly anti-Russia, but voted for the opposition bloc. They felt excluded from Ukraine. Why did many Ukrainians in the East support opposition bloc? And after Putin's war, what might be done to overcome Eastern alienation?
That's because that particular region was politically the electoral base of the Party of Regions, an influential party in Ukraine before the revolution, which positioned itself as a pro-Russian party. Even so, in reality, the oligarchs, the uber rich who funded this party, they didn't want the Russian oligarchs to come and take over. But it's so much easier to condition your audience around the issues of language, nationalism, hatred. It's much more difficult to deal with issues of social benefits, paying pensions, helping the disabled. So that in that division in Ukrainian politics into certain regions controlled by the parties emphasizing the issues of the Russian language and the rights of the Russian speakers, prepared the ground for the Russian invasion. And what happened was that this party, which prepared the ground, then disappeared. It completely folded. And that's a lesson really in politics. So you can spend decades mobilizing your population around the issues that are sort of not really expensive ones. They don't require so much investments as being new hospitals, you know, and in Ukraine, most retirement pensions are funded by the state at this point. They're transitioning to a system which looks more like our system, but these people receive miserable pensions. Like most of the elderly in Ukraine are poor, are enormously poor. So what to do? How to deal with a situation like that? So the language and the radical rhetoric proved an easier way of mobilizing them for this agenda. And that was a problem, because I really think that people need to reach out to their fellows in the region. The population has been displaced. I hope some of the displaced population is going to come back. And I hope when that happens, there will be a way to establish a better understanding, and also I hope with support of the Western donors, a better standard of life for Ukrainians everywhere, so that they don't get mobilized around the issues of, you know, language and memory only, but also about the issues that matter to us, hospitals, you know, social welfare, things like that.
Yeah, just to chime in, I think that many of those geographies of discontent and grievances are grievances that you typically see from regions to capital elites when they feel like things are centralized and decisions are centralized. And so Ukraine has embarked in the last several years since that time on decentralization reforms, which have been very, very important to enhance decision-making power in the regions, and including public sector finance and investment. And that region of Ukraine has also, like said, he had controlling oligarchs who have been highly, highly influential and dominant in the politics, and who have stolen colossally, let's be honest, from these very, very poor people who have borne the brunt of that theft. And that has to end. That type of oligarchical control and theft has to end. And hence Ukraine has been also embarking on serious anti-corruption reforms.
Thank you. So we have some questions that are specifically related to what is happening in a military, what is happening on the ground, I guess. So the first question is, this is from Rachel Roy. How does the ceasefire work? I guess in the most recent one, Russia just ignored that they had agreed to one, as many civilians in Ukraine were still targeted. Do you know more about what happened? Was this the government or other troops groups ignoring orders? I know that this is right in the news now.
It's a complex issue. First of all, Russia made a point of not stopping the attacks during the negotiations. That was the first one. Secondly, though, I think the intention was that any ceasefire would produce a desirable political results for the Russian side, so that any refugees would actually go to Russia or to the Russian-controlled territories. It was not necessarily a welcome, a favorable solution for the Russian military on the ground or for the Russian government. And I think in this particular case, we have the two sides which deeply distrust each other. Ukrainian side for a good reason, and the Russian side because they do not want to lose the propaganda war. So it's important for them to insist that it is actually the Ukrainian side which does not allow the truce, a ceasefire. In reality, it's more likely that the Russian side is doing this simply because it dictates the rules of the war. The Ukrainian position is always demonstrating that we are ready to talk. But that's not necessarily the Russian position. The Russian position, of course, is that we are expecting Ukraine to accept all our demands. And by the way, we are going to continue to shoot as the negotiations are unfolding. So I think it's pretty easy to determine from this general situation of who has a stronger hand and to whose advantage it is to undermine any truce ceasefire. So that's a larger issue, which also pertains to what we have discussed already, the war of information.
Yeah, I just want to add that the Russian military is targeting and murdering civilians, even pulling them from cars and shooting them as they try and flee. And I have no words for such evil.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Yes, I was going to say something, but nothing I say is adequate. So other questions, is there any fear that the conflict will spread into Moldavia? I think perhaps Moldova. This is Matthew Drolet Dugway. And how does Ukraine position itself in relation to Transnistria?
Transnistria is a separatist region in the neighboring Republic of Moldova, which emerged during the conflict sponsored by the Russian side in the early 1990s. Transnistria is actually a good example of how modern national identities are political rather than ethnic. Most people in Transnistria are ethnic Ukrainians, but they identify with strong Russia. The government of the Moldova is, of course, concerned about this, but I think it's more of a concern about what is going to happen to Ukraine and the possibility that Moldova would end up having a much longer border with Russia or Russian-controlled republics. In the same way, Poland is enormously concerned. Even so, Poland is a member of the NATO. Latvia, Lithuania, other countries that are already bordering on Russia, or if a democratic Ukraine were to collapse, which it will not, would be more exposed to the possibility of Russian sabotage, potential even invasion. And I think what really matters in this situation is the clear position from the West that all the national borders should not be violated. And it's not just about Ukraine, it's not just about the countries of the NATO. If you try doing something like that with any other country, the reaction would be similar and stronger.
I don't want to add anything.
Okay, so I have another question about NATO, but this is more about like the history of NATO, or I guess the history of military conflict with NATO. And this question comes from Dana Graham Lai, who asks, do you think that the West, and in parentheses NATO, was too hasty after the fall of the Iron Curtain to pull their forces and Canadian troops out of countries like Germany, the Netherlands, etc.? As a member of that presence in West Germany during the latter part of the Cold War, I always felt uneasy. I was hoping you could connect this to Ukraine, how this action may have affected Ukraine or made them vulnerable.
Well, there are two things here. One is the perception propagated by the Russian Federation that the NATO is forever aggressive and trying to incorporate as many states as possible. The other, the actual policies within the NATO alliance, and in particular our own government, the Canadian government, for decades have not been fulfilling a major obligation of the NATO Charter, which consisted of spending more than 2% of the budget on military expenses. We have allowed ourselves, and a number of other countries have allowed themselves, to spend less, to save money on that, in the hope that the world was now safe, that no war would ever start in our lifetimes, that there would be no aggressor. And of course, Germany very notably is now rethinking this policy, and other European countries are going to go up to 2% or over 2%. And I think it's time for Canada to realize as well now, with the Canadian jets and Canadian troops very much welcome in the Baltic states and providing such a valuable training in Ukraine, that unfortunately, as I've said, answering another question, it looks like Mr. Putin is pushing us back in the historical past, in the period of the Cold War, if not the period when belonging was defined by blood. So it's the legacy of the 20th century, which we went through many times. We have condemned it. We thought we were through. And yet he is dragging us back into this. So Canada will have to pick up the bill as well. We can no longer pretend that a military presence is no longer important. That's not the way things are going to work out with Mr. Putin.
I just mention that, of course, Canada shares a border territorial with Russia, and Russia claims Arctic territory as their own. We have right now borders disputes with Russia, and they've been quite aggressive going into territorial waters and buzzing and doing aggressive maneuvers, and we just kind of have ignored it for the most part.
Yes, and our border with Russia is a very long one. And
climate change is opening it up, and they want to use it for different routes. So this just look 10 years down the line and think what we need to do about this.
So more military strategy questions from Beverly Tallant. With the demise of the Soviet Union, Russia lost considerable coastal footage, access which they had previously had for export income purposes, as well as strategic coastal military bases for defense or aggressive activity. Aside from Putin's almost Napoleonic ambitions and ideology, might this be a factor in his desire to reacquire Ukraine with its coastlines?
That's a very imperial argument, of course, as you realize, right? So all the empires lost their possessions overseas with such valuable things as slaves, like ivory, military bases. So it's time for Russia to go through the process and realize that they are now a nation, not an empire, and that is precisely the problem. Obviously, the positioning of the Black Sea Fleet was an issue for the Russian government because the lease on Sevastopol was expiring. They constantly renewed the lease on the military base of Sevastopol in the Crimea. But it would be, I think, too simple to ascribe things like occupying part of a territory from your neighbor just because you needed a port on the Black Sea or things like that. The Black Sea is basically, you cannot get anywhere without passing through the straits, and the straits are controlled by Turkey, which is a member of NATO. So there is a lot of Russian rhetoric about, oh, we've lost bases there, but I think it's all global. For instance, Russia is still using the military bases in Syria, established by the Soviets decades ago. So they do have enough bases for everything. It's just one of those things of trying to give a rational background to the choices and actions that are intrinsically aggressive and imperialistic. So yes, the Soviet Union was larger, but yes, you are Russia, you are not the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union has collapsed. Everybody has left the Soviet Union, and Russia was actually one of the republics rejecting the Soviet Union and leaving the Soviet Union. You cannot just turn around and say, oh, sorry, I changed my mind. May I have this back? All of it. And of course, including Alaska possibly as well. So yes, there are things that the Russian side is saying, but I really struggle to find, even from the military point of view, a persuasive argument in this. Like if they wanted a friendly Ukraine, a Ukraine which would not have American missiles, was attacking Ukraine the way to go about it? Or would it produce a Ukraine which would be an enemy with all kinds of consequences? And then it's also the way, not just the way of formulating the grievances, but it's also the way about addressing them that betrays the lack of realization in Russia that this is not how we act in the 21st century.
I just, but to add to that, there is just no future in this imperialist worldview. And the way Russian society and economy has been set up, there's almost no future there. No productivity, no innovation, kleptocratic elites who spend all of their money in Europe. There's just no future in that worldview. It is not viable, and I don't believe it's actually what younger generations in particular want. And my dad keeps reminding me of this Gramsci quote: "The old world is dead and the new one is struggling to be born, but now is the time for monsters." And Ukraine is taking on the monsters right now. And I just completely reject that there's any future in this day and age in this type of chauvinist imperialism.
Thank you so much for saying both of those things. I think those are really important points. I'm just putting in the chat right now a link to an event that's taking place on Friday at UBC. This event is specifically about, it's called Russia's Invasion of Ukraine, an expert panel on the geopolitical and humanitarian crisis. It is hosted by our colleagues in the Department of Political Science, and Dr. Yekelchyk will also be speaking at it, but it will be much more focused on these kind of questions. That being said, I have a couple of other strategic questions in the Q&A. So the first one from Grazia Merle is, in your opinion, should the EU and the United States give the planes to Poland so that Ukraine can defend itself? Is the fear of a third world war realistic?
I don't think even the Russian government can challenge the decision by the Polish government to transfer some of the old Soviet planes to Ukraine. What I'm concerned about is that this is really a symbolic gesture, because modern planes need more than just the planes. They need radar equipment, they need the missile systems protecting the radar equipment. It's a big chunk of what is necessary there. Now, Poland, like some other former members of the Warsaw Pact, is very eager to get rid of the Soviet planes and transition fully to the military hardware used by the NATO. There is a very strong case to be made that Ukraine was attacked in a large measure because the West was so timid in supplying Ukraine with the arms. Everybody was constantly worried about provoking Russia. Well, Russia invaded anyway. So what was your point about not provoking Russia? There was an opportunity, an ample opportunity, to provide Ukraine with air defenses that would be modern and up to date, and to train many more Ukrainian soldiers than we did help to train. So it's time actually to realize that all this rhetoric emanating particularly from Germany and France, the countries which happen to be addicted to the Russian gas and other things, was in fact a huge mistake. So the way to provoke Russia was not to create a strong Ukrainian army. So a strong Ukrainian army was not the way of provoking Russia. A weak Ukrainian army would be the way to provoke Russia, because this is what in fact happened. And I guess it's one of those lessons of dealing with a very assertive and chauvinistic Russia in the age after imperial collapse.
So Russia's fired over 600 missiles at Ukrainian cities and is committing mass murder. And I do stand by the word genocide. This is the destruction of a people. I look it up. It fits by the UN definition, certainly. And then we saw them level cities in Syria. Do we just stand by and let them do this again? We need air support now. That is my answer to that question.
Over to you, Katya.
Thank you. I wanted to pause for a moment because that was a very powerful statement from Dr. Krawchenko. Okay, so Megan Swift asks, what would it take to end this war? Do you think there is any possibility of compromise to arrive at peace?
The Russian society, I think, would have to rebel against Mr. Putin's regime. And perhaps the Russian elites would need to realize that the consequences of this aggressive war are unacceptable to them, as well as to Russia more generally. Compromises would be greatly unfair to Ukraine, I think, which believed in Western ideas and followed these ideas, and then now has to fight for its existence.
Yeah, I when I look at the negotiations and what Russia is asking, Russia is kind of asking for Ukrainians not to exist anymore as a people, to not have sovereignty, to lose their identity, their very being. And I can say after generation and generation of facing this, Ukrainians have just had enough. And this has to end. I don't know where the negotiations will end, but the position of the Kremlin is so vile and so destructive to an entire nation that I don't know how you negotiate from that position.
Yeah, compromise is unacceptable to Mr. Putin to start with. So we shouldn't worry about persuading Ukrainians because Mr. Putin wants everything. So the only
he denies, denying the very existence and identity of Ukraine. How do you start negotiating from that position?
It's not a position you can negotiate from. Okay, so Elkno asks a follow-up question. Is the overthrow of Putin by Russians a possibility given the economic impact of sanctions on the Russian people?
The Russian society will need to politically mobilize. The Russian government just took all the means for politically mobilizing away from them. It's basically disabling all the social media networks, lying to its citizens about what is going on, not delivering the bodies of the fallen soldiers. So it's very difficult for the Russians to mobilize. But there's a role, I think, for the wider world, for the West and for Ukraine in trying to reach out to the Russians about it. They are the only ones, I think, who can really end Mr. Putin's rule, which is now escalating into aggressive wars and threats, using nuclear threats as well, which is something fairly unprecedented in the 21st century for a major player on the international scene.
I just want to say that the sanctions are so important. We have to keep them up. We cannot let them slip. And we have to decarbonize our economies, especially in Europe, where they're highly reliant on Russian oil. This is imperative, and it's absolutely ambitious, and it simply has to be done. We cannot support this type of imperialism and genocide.
So I have, I'm going to take one last audience question, and then maybe Dr. Yekelchyk points out he will need to leave soon. So I will just ask my final question. And my final question, and if Thais, you could put up the last slide right now. My final question is, what do you both think are the most valuable, important things that we can do to help right now?
Show up for the Ukrainian rallies in support of Ukraine. Make a donation to one of those very respectable charities. Write to a member of the parliament demanding that Canada needs to do more to help Ukraine, because it's not only about Ukraine, it's about the world which we came to accept for granted. And we are now being pushed back into the 20th century, into, I would even say, the mid-20th century. So there is a variety of roles for our listeners, both politically and as benefactors, and also the people trying to find out more and spread the word about what the conflict is really all about.
I would add that it would be wonderful that these acts of solidarity are so important, they're so motivating, and they are having an impact. And that interest in Ukraine and trying to understand who Ukraine are as an identity, people, and culture is just so important too right now, because these are Ukrainians have been so long oppressed and subsumed, right, by all other narratives. Finally, they need to have a voice of their own, and amplifying that is important. And the last thing I'd like to say is that in the last week, I've heard from so many people in such kind acts of solidarity, including friends who are in Afghanistan who are trying to flee, including, friends who are Indigenous, who deeply understand what it means to have suffered from genocide and authoritarianism and colonialism and oppression, and that I stand in solidarity with all oppressed peoples and have such compassion for these experiences. And we have a history of embracing refugees in Canada, and there will be more refugees from this and other crises. And just to have compassion, and we as a community are going to have to come together and support those people as we have in the past. And that will be a project for us as well. And just to thank everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much for your time and for sharing all of this with us. I know this has been a really important conversation, and I really appreciate that we are able to host you here at UBC and that we were able to have this conversation tonight. For everyone in the audience, thank you so much for coming. And this event has been recorded, and the recording will go up on our website later. Well, as soon as it's available, basically. I'm putting in the chat a link to a resources page on our website. This also has donation links, and it also has other information about Ukrainian history, about Ukrainian culture, politics, information sources where you can find information in English that is reliable about what's happening. So please go there if you have other questions. And that event on Friday will also be a good event if you have more questions about military strategy, security, geopolitics. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a good night.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.